There's something weird, and it don't look good.
For context, I live in Southeast Asia, and this happened many years ago. I was about 9 when this happened. This was not my first experience with paranormal stuff, but it was the most unsettling. During my holidays, my parents sent me off to a short camp at an old school that has a dormitory built within its premises. We later found out the dorm was built near an old cemetery. Everything seemed normal until the evening. I made friends with the other kids there, and unfortunately one of the girls staying in my dorm room, 2 bunk beds, 4 kids, had to leave as her grandma was in the hospital. This left the top bunk of my bed empty. I found it hard to sleep, being anxious away from my home, and was the last one awake in our room. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I started to feel really uneasy. It felt like the safety got sucked out of the room. I was laying down facing the wall, so I turned around to see if anyone had entered our room. Instead, I saw a pale face hanging down from the top bunk, staring at me. It's hard to remember all the details, but what stuck with me was its huge, red mouth. It looked human, except it had an abnormally large, blood-red mouth and was smiling. Its eyes were wide with what I perceived as glee. The entity did not come any closer to me, but it stayed hanging over the bunk with that sick smile and started swaying. This made me scared to move past it, as I sensed it did not have good intentions. I had my phone with me, so I called my parents to come fetch me, as I did not want to spend another day there. My phone's dial pad glitched a few times, but eventually I was able to contact them, and around 4 a.m. the camp leader moved me to another room. He said I had to stay the remaining 2 nights, as it was part of their policy apparently, but the other 2 nights were peaceful. I spoke to 2 people staying at my first dorm, and they said they slept fine. I tried to search up what the entity could be, but did not really find any conclusive answers. Does anyone have any theories? Edit. I spoke to my mum. She confirmed that the dorm was built on a former cemetery ground, not near a cemetery. It was a winter evening in France. I was in the car with 3 of my buddies, 2 seated in the back, 1 who drove, and I was seated on the front passenger seat next to the driver. We had a pleasant time, and our friend R, the only one between us with a car, was getting us home. During the ride, we were discussing about many irrelevant things. We were almost at my home, and I was tired, so did not speak anymore. Instead, I was looking at the landscape, lost in my thought. Suddenly, out of the corner of my left eye, I felt like someone was watching me. At the time, I didn't pay attention. I thought, oh, this is R who wants to talk to me. I threw a quick glance and saw that R was not looking at me. She was focused on the road. So I went back to my thoughts. But again, from the corner of my eye, I saw someone looking at me, and I perceived a facial movement, as someone who shook his face from left to right. It was so insistent that I looked back at R to see if she was looking at me, and asked her if she wanted something, but again, I saw her focused on the road. And that's when I saw it. There was a human being shape that sat in the place of my friend R, as if it was in her body or something like that. It had a human form but was grey smoke, with a head, eyes and a mouth, but instead of eyes and a mouth it was black holes. So it was this creature that looked at me for a few moments. I was so surprised and shocked that I could not take my eyes off this thing. The strangest thing was that the creature seemed even more surprised and scared than I was. It shook its head in all directions. This is the movement I had seen from the corner of my eye, and it was as if it was surprised that I could see it. It had an expression of astonishment on its face, or what can be called a face, as well as fear, and still stared at me. My friends seemed to see nothing, and the creature did not seem to be bothered by them. It was me it looked at. Then I looked elsewhere, and fortunately we arrived in front of my home. I looked to my friend R again, but it was gone. I did not tell my friends because I didn't even know how to describe what I'd just seen, and I thought that no one would believe me. A long time after, I tried to think about what it could be. My first thought, it could be the angel of my friend because it was positioned exactly as her and seemed concerned with her driving. While it looked at me too, it threw occasional eye shoots on the road as well. Then I thought that maybe it was a demon, but it is unlikely because the creature seemed really surprised and scared that I could see it, and I never heard of demons that could be scared by humans. Or maybe it was just a hallucination. If you have any ideas, please let me know. Back in 2006, I stayed the night at my girlfriend's, now wife's, house. It was the middle of winter and there was a storm passing through, so my girlfriend and her parents suggested I stay the night. This was a relief since I lived 40 minutes away, and the wintry mixes can make the roads quite icy and difficult to drive on. This is Middle Tennessee. Her parents' house is your typical 60s ranch-style home. It still had the wood panel walls that was common in that era, and creaky wooden floors. I stayed in the spare bedroom that was right across from my girlfriend's. I always have a problem sleeping in different beds, even on vacation, but I'd spent the night once or twice prior to this and knew what to expect. I kissed my girlfriend goodnight, went into the spare bedroom and fell asleep. I woke up suddenly, hours later, to the sound of slow, heavy, thudding footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was her dad walking to the bathroom. It wasn't. I heard the steps continue down the hallway before stopping at the door of the spare bedroom. The bedroom occupied by me. The steps continued into the bedroom. The door did not open. My heart was beating out of my chest. Slowly, the steps made their way to the bed and stopped. Internally, I was in full panic mode, but I was somehow able to remain calm. A few seconds later, I could feel it sit or lean on the bed beside me. I was facing the wall, so I really had no idea what was behind me. I managed to somehow move a little closer to the wall. It too moved closer. I quickly grabbed my cell phone and called my girlfriend. I had already figured that whatever was behind me wasn't human, so I didn't necessarily feel physically threatened. She answered after a few rings and I asked her to come into the room. Maybe she thought it was a midnight rendezvous. She walks into the room and a few seconds later flips on the light and asks me what's going on. I turn around and there's nothing beside me. It takes me a minute to collect myself. I brush everything off and make up some story and tell her to go back to sleep. I take out my laptop and play some Christian music, hoping that it'll ward off any future guest. The next morning, I tell her exactly what happened. She wasn't shocked. She told me stories of how she and her sister would hear typing in the middle of the night in her dad's office when they knew nobody was in there. She's heard someone run up the basement steps and slam the door shut, and nobody would be there. Her aunt had a similar experience as mine with the footsteps in the hall. She got up to see if anyone was there, and the hallway was empty. To this day, I'm still a little paranoid when going over to my in-laws, especially when I have to go to the back bedrooms. A few years ago, we were living with them in between selling our house and moving to the next home. One evening, I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and am pretty certain I heard someone whisper outside the bathroom door. I've somewhat brushed it off, but the memories are still there. Oh, and apparently, her parents have never witnessed anything after living there for almost 30 years. Lucky them. When I was about 12 years old, so around 1987, my father and I moved from Fort Worth, Texas, to a tiny little town in Arkansas called Mena for his job as a mechanical drafter. We were only supposed to be there for a couple of months, so his boss helped pay for a weekly tutor to keep up with my education, and he arranged for us to stay in a house that had been built only 5 or so years prior to accommodate previous workers. I remember when we first arrived at this place in the middle of nowhere. Despite when it was built, it already seemed very, very old. The weeds and trees had not been trimmed for quite a while, and they scraped and brushed along the sides and roof of the car as it slowly bucked and bounced its way up the long, rocky driveway. There was a thick woods of tall trees surrounding the property that blocked the sunlight even in the middle of the day, and constantly gave the house a cold, dark look. The inside wasn't much better. The floor and walls were plain varnished wood throughout most of the rooms. There were electrical lines running through the forest of the structure, but we would come to find out that the electricity would go out randomly all the time, and you might wait hours or days for it to come back on. Furthermore, to my dismay, our TV could barely pick up one static obscured channel, and it was the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS. Needless to say, this was a horrible place for a city kid like me. My dad had to work long hours away from home, leaving me in this eerily quiet dark patch of wilderness without another kid or even another person for miles around. The couple of months that his boss said we would be there multiplied, and every day seemed to be pure torture to me. Even the tutor that came once a week wasn't a relief from the suffocating loneliness. I couldn't hide how uncomfortable I was in that environment, and my dad constantly apologized and said we would leave as soon as we could, but it wouldn't be soon enough. One evening while my father was at work, I was on the living room floor playing with a Hot Wheels and Matchbox car city I created when, suddenly, I realized that it had gotten darker and cooler in the room. Perhaps the faulty electricity was causing the lights to dim and the heater to malfunction, but I also started to feel like something bad was about to happen. It was a sort of feeling like any second there would be a sudden loud clap of thunder or some other jump scare, but what came next was much worse than just that. As I sat there, waiting and listening to the silence, there was another, separate darkness slowly growing in the corner of my right eye. It was like a shadow moving against the wall, about 10 feet away. The feeling of fear had moved into my stomach now, and I was trembling as I turned my eyes and then my head with extreme caution in that direction. I sat and watched as a dark stain, for lack of a better word, was seeping outward from a corner of the room where the wooden walls met the wooden floor. It didn't seem like an absence of light, but an actual change in the color of the wood, and it was growing slowly but noticeably. There was an accompanying creaking, crackling noise, like wood being twisted. The outer edges of the darkness spread out like water and saturated the wood, making it look darker red and brown, while the center, radiating at least a foot outward from the corner, was a very dark matte black that looked like the blackest, starless void of space. As soon as I had completely turned to see it straight on, all in an instant I saw a pair of human eyes snap open in the center, staring at me for the briefest of moments. Then there was a loud bang as the TV turned on, lit up, popped, and the house went completely black. Within the next second, I heard and felt the thing rush from the corner, as if it was a person shuffling on all fours to stop inches away from my face and breathe or pant exhaustedly or excitedly in front of me. I must have passed out at that point, because that is all I recall until the middle of the next day. I remember my father putting me into the passenger seat of my aunt's car and telling her he would pick me up as soon as he could clear things up with his boss. My aunt seemed very concerned for me as she drove me away, and I remember feeling like a dark haze was gradually leaving me the further we drove away, but it was gradually replaced by a fear for my dad staying behind in that house. It wasn't a few days, but a few years before he was able to come and pick me up at my aunt's house, and we returned to our former home in Fort Worth. As he drove, he told me that when he found me that night, I was huddled up with my face staring into a corner of the living room. When I asked about the thing I saw, he didn't answer my question. He just seemed worried and started telling me jokes to get my mind off it. Years later, in 1996 to be precise, I found myself out of a job and down on my luck. My dad had moved into a very small apartment at this point, so I couldn't stay with him until I got back on my feet and wouldn't allow myself to impose on my aunt again. To my surprise, my father told me that he had purchased the small Arkansas house from his former boss around 1989, and I was welcome to go clean it up and live there as long as I liked. At this point, I had convinced myself that the events of that night, years before, had to be the result of isolation and youthful imagination. Besides, I didn't see that I had much of a choice but to make the best of this. So on a late fall day, I found myself driving up the broken path to the house. The roadway and the overgrowth had even more time to get out of hand. As I reached the house, I found it, unfortunately, in a severe state of ruin. Vandals or severe weather had broken some of the windows and doors. Rain rotted out portions of the exposed interior, and wild animals had come and gone. It wasn't livable at this point. I would have to accept a loan that my dad offered me and find another place to plant my feet. But out of curiosity, I entered the living room and pointed a flashlight into that corner. There was a darkness. Not a growing, creeping darkness, but a still, dark stain. The same size and shape that I remembered. And in the very center, on the floor, sat one of my old, favorite toy cars. But it looked very beat up and worn, like it had been smashed around on the floor repeatedly since the day the house became vacant. I always took care of my cars, so at first, I didn't think it was mine. It was the only object in the entire empty house other than debris, almost as if it were some sort of bait, luring me to reach out and take it from the corner. And for some reason, I let it. I quickly snatched it up from its resting spot, as if I was stealing a bone from an angry dog. I turned it over in my hand and saw my initials painted on the bottom. It was indeed one of mine. I kept it to this day. I'm not sure why. Maybe as a reminder. Maybe as a curiosity. Long, but very, very real. I've been waiting to write this one up because, frankly, I still don't know how to process it. Additionally, I am not xenophobic towards Spanish people. I have been rather fortunate in my experiences beyond the physical realm as being largely positive, even protective. The only times I've ever felt a dark or malignant force was as a sort of warning, like an alarm bell. Kind of like if you were to meet someone and something is just off about them, and instinct tells you to stay away from them. I've had that feeling with both places and people. This experience, however, took me wholly by surprise. I've certainly found that having my guard down leaves me very susceptible to spirit interactions. In the summer of 2017, I traveled to Europe for my first time to meet up with one of my best girlfriends. She had been studying in Paris and fell in lust with a Spanish guy who moved back to Barcelona. I'd wanted to come visit her in Paris, but she asked me to meet her in Barcelona, and we would then travel to Paris together. I've never been too keen on Spain personally. Gothic architecture, paella, Picasso, all cool. But 500 years of Inquisition, brutality, torture, and cruelty are inexcusable. That kind of hatred leaves a mark deeper than time can heal. Barcelona certainly isn't the only place I've traveled to that I could describe as having earth soaked with blood. Upon landing in Israel at age 13, that was literally my first thought feeling. Not new blood, centuries upon centuries of it. I've also traveled extensively throughout Eastern Europe and the Balkans, including concentration and death camps. However, what happened in Barcelona that sunny day in 2017 forced me to reevaluate my willingness to be a conduit for spirits. We were on a free walking tour, winding through the narrow corridors of the Gothic Quarter in the ruins of what had been the castle of those great arseholes Ferdinand and Isabella. Our guide, a lovely, jovial, Australian expat, led us 15 or so tourists, single file through the alleyways. Tall stone walls almost entirely blocked the rays from the midday summer sun at times, shrouding us in a shifty, gloomy grey. Occasionally, these alleys would open into courtyards, and as we approached one in particular, traces of what sounded like music could be heard. As we were at the mouth of one particular courtyard about to enter, our guide lowered his voice to a hush and told us to have a seat on a low stone staircase and just chill, rest, and listen for a few minutes. There were two men sitting on the ground making music. I use quotation marks there because this was not music as we would normally describe it. It was more of a ritualistic droning, and they weren't playing traditional instruments. One man had a plastic bucket, and the other a palm frond. All was quiet except for this building, pulsing sound bath. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was just lazily half focused on these musicians, letting my mind drift off. All of a sudden my eyes welled with tears, which isn't uncommon when I am close to spirit. But this was completely unusual, as they wouldn't stop flowing, even if I tried to bleep them away. Tears started streaming down my face and neck, soaking my shirt. My face literally became a faucet, made even odder by the fact that I wasn't feeling sad or even overwhelmed by a particular emotion yet. Then, my body began shaking violently, starting with my hands and moving up my arms to my head and down to my feet. Not like a seizure, more like extremely severe shivering. Just a note, the ambient temperature was around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 29 degrees Celsius. It was August. My friend touched my shoulder looking extremely concerned and mouthed, "WTF, are you okay?" I responded soundlessly by shrugging and shaking my head, widening my eyes in confusion. I literally had no idea why I was having such a reaction. My heart felt like it had been ripped out, as though I was an unending well of sorrow. Meanwhile, the musicians had not stopped. The tears were still flowing and the shaking was unabated. Finally, our guide approached the tour group and whispered, "I was waiting for the guys to take a break, but since we have to move on, please stand up quietly, turn around the corner behind you and look closely at the stone walls." I turned and saw what had been previously obscured by a shadow. Hebrew letters. The walls were inlaid and built with Jewish tombstones from desecrated graveyards after all the Jews had been killed, forced to convert, or driven from Spain. No one was left to tend them, and thus the tombstones became fodder for building the walls of an evil empire. A tragically common occurrence. The Nazis built the roads to Treblinka using Jewish tombstones as well. I had absolutely no idea that I was surrounded by the desecrated graves of my ancestors, but something deep in my soul apparently did. Our lovely tour guide was very concerned as to why I was so upset, but I wasn't sobbing or even really sniffling. It felt as though I was being used as a conduit by voices snuffed out too early for all the wrong reasons. I literally felt the sorrow of the ages pouring out of me, not like my own personal sorrow. Thankfully, we ended the tour with a beer in a lovely pub, and my friend and I spent the evening sharing our experiences with the beyond. I've performed multiple rituals since then communicating with the spirit that I'm not okay with possession, but I will gladly pass along messages as I receive them. I don't know how to end this story. I do know that Barcelona is last on my list of places to revisit. Besides this experience, a good friend of mine was mugged, beaten and left for dead in the street on the same trip. So Barcelona, you're lovely and all, but let's not meet again.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.